Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this session. Something I'm very passionate about is crafting UX research case study. This conversation came about through me mentoring a lot of different people, both UX designers, researchers, actually some product managers too, on different best UX research practices. Oftentimes I notice that people don't necessarily know what is a research specific case study. I think there's a lot of information about how to create a UX design case study or how to talk about, your impact, but there's not too many things that focus really in on hey, if you were to, present your work and there's research involved, how do you tailor that research to really land when it comes to applying for these jobs? So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Q&A is at the end, but I also like to give the vibe that these sessions are very relaxed and low key. So if you want to be off camera, doing something in the background, cleaning, anything, and listening to me, please feel free to do so. Won't be offended at all. But yeah, with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. So just a little bit about me. So I am pretty much a researcher, currently work at Rocket. That is pretty much, you can think of as a home buying experience from starting to search for a home to getting a mortgage to servicing that mortgage. So worked a lot in finances. Also have worked a bit in education and definitely a lot in technology. Also have a master's degree in human computer interaction and design, just graduated last year with that. And I am also based in sunny California, if you're wondering about where I'm at right now. Okay, so how are we going to work out for today's session? So pretty much the way I like to present this is I kind of want to start with the end in mind. So I really want to talk more so about what is the final end state, so to speak, because oftentimes, as I said, when you're looking for UX research specific case studies, there's really not much out there. I want to present to you kind of what I used actually in the past to apply to Rocket. And then afterwards, we'll actually go backwards and I'll show you okay, now that you know the context of what we're going for, how do you go about the process of actually planning it out? What are key elements to include? What are also some common mistakes or pitfalls that I'm seeing? And then last but certainly not least, we'll have Q&A at the end. So with that said, we'll start off with the example case study. So I am going to switch my tab here and showcase what I actually used, again, in my application process. I'm not going to go through the whole entire thing, but I'm really just going to talk more so high level to what I was trying to highlight and showcase when I had to present this case study. So first things first, obviously, I'm showcasing a potential redesign. So the first thing you're going to want to do in a case study, so you're going to want to explain what you're talking about, at least in the very upfront. So in this case, I talk about what is potential, and I give a very high-level summary saying, the potential screen in Acorns, which was the previous company I worked for, it's a calculator that estimates how much customers can earn by investing in their Acorns account, allowing them to adjust their reoccurring deposits to see the impact of their potential growth. So as you can see here, this is a very, this is literally a 1 to 2 sentence summary of what I'm talking about here. I'm trying really hard not to use any jargon, any complex terms. I'm really trying to say, hey, it's an investing calculator and it shows you how much you can potentially grow your money over time. That's it. So laying out the groundwork here very simply. The next thing that I did, since this was a vocal presentation, oftentimes you're thinking about, okay, what's your problem statement or what's the background context for how did this research come to be? So in this case, I like to have a little bit more fun with it instead of just saying this is the problem statement. I actually took the time to kind of do a mock demo of the conversation between me and the product manager. It was at the time, it was for a rebrand and we hadn't done any renovations on that screen yet that had a lot of high traffic to it. I basically talked about how did this project come to be? What were my suggestions? And from that, we created a research plan. So in this case, you'll see here, I'm talking about 2 different studies here. They did ask me to present 2 different case studies. In this case, I broke it up into the different methodologies. So I have January, which was a survey, April, which was interviews, and then in the final section here, you can see I do more about the redesign launch. So this is more so me talking about the classic things that you see in your case study reports, which is what's the impact? What's the next steps? What are your reflections? Your learnings? all that stuff I kind of bunched up together at the end to talk more about the cohesive experience of running both of these case studies side by side. So that way it kind of has a bit more of a nicer finish to it. So I'm going to do pretty much a clear run through of study 1, and then study 2 has a lot of the same mechanics or the same structure as the first study. So this one I'll go more in depth in, and then the second one I'll do a bit more high level. So case studies. First thing you must, I really highly recommend, is establish what is the objective. This isn't the background, the problem statement, so to speak, but it's more so focused on from the context of just the research. What are you trying to do here? What's the end goal? In this case, it was actually pretty straightforward because it's a redesign. So I'm really just looking at what are the current pain points, what parts of the calculator are confusing, and establishing some benchmarks. So that way we can do a pre and a post test. So again, these are I'm not using any jargon. I'm trying to say, here's like, we're trying to identify opportunities for this redesign. 1, 2, 3. That's it. So don't feel like you have to show a really complex diagram if you have 10 to 20 different objectives. That's fair. Some research cases do have that, but really I'd say try to bubble it down to like the top 3, so to speak. In this case, I had an overarching theme that I used as the top. This screen, I would say, is probably the most important. I say a lot of things are important, but this is probably the most important thing, is when you're talking about your research, you want to talk about why you pick a methodology. This is what inspired me doing this actual presentation in the first place, because oftentimes what I've seen is I'll talk to a mentee and they'll say, okay, I did a survey, and then after the survey, we went ahead and we started doing the analysis, and then we started getting into the findings. And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. Why did you pick a survey? That to me showcases pretty much like what is your level of knowledge with research. Like you knowing what methods to identify is really at the end of the day what makes me know like, okay, this person understands the basics around how to pick research methods. So in this case, I'm talking about I did a survey because I'm prioritizing pain points. I'm establishing statistical validation, and also I'm introducing constraints here as well. So the product manager needed insights in a very timely manner for road mappings. Hence, we wanted to do a survey because it's quick and it's easy to get some feedback on that. This is really like if you're a product manager or a UX designer who can't do a full research case study because you have other design elements or product management elements in the process, just know you want to at least touch on the point of why you're doing this methodology. Just a line or two about it alone can help a lot when it comes to stakeholders being a bit more impressed of like, oh, okay, they really know their stuff. Now on the opposite end of that, we have survey logistics. And when I say opposite end, I mean, this is something that I see people tend to overemphasize, but don't necessarily need to. At the end of the day, I'm just looking for a rough estimate. If I'm interviewing people with regards to like, okay, like how long does it take on average? So here I said 2 weeks, and I broke down a little bit of like, around the rough time frame of things, but I'm not necessarily going super specific, giving a specific date and time for each of these things. Just something to keep in mind. You don't have to go super crazy in logistics. Just a high level overview will totally suffice here. So for recruitment, this is something that I say between how much info you should really think about. This is kind of the middle ground. Recruitment is something that is important in terms of, again, explaining the why you've recruited people in a particular way. This is something where it's like, okay, I wanted to talk in this case study that we know we need to be recruiting people that are both very new to the calculator, but we also want to be recruiting people that are longtime avid fans of the calculator, because we don't want to make something that's super user friendly, but then all of a sudden we're removing like the pieces that the fan base just absolutely love about this calculator. There were some people that really love this calculator. So it's something that we just want to make sure we're really trying to keep consistent and make sure that you're thinking about this in the way of like, okay, what type of information do I want to present here? But it's not necessarily, I guess I would say it's not necessarily information where you need to go fully in depth, but just high level. Why is it it? You'll see here, I have blurred out information in FinTech. So I do not want FINRA or SEC to come hunting after me. However, I'm really showcasing here more so what is my thought process and how I ask these types of questions. So you can see a high level overview of what types of questions I'm asking here. This is what I would say if you're a researcher, something to consider. If you're a product manager or designer, you don't necessarily have to go into it, but I find that oftentimes people don't mention anything about how they analyze their work. They just kind of jump from, we recruited these people and now we're jumping straight into the results. And as a researcher, I'm often looking for like, well, what was your process for how do you analyze these things? And something I mentioned in my interview was I actually talked a bit about how I use AI peer debriefing. Anyone that doesn't know it, it's really just as simple as running through the data with AI in mind. So that way you're doing the analysis and then you're using AI to gut check your work to see, is there any themes that AI is seeing that you didn't necessarily catch? Really great if you're a solo researcher. But again, I talk about it very briefly just so that way people know kind of some of my logistics or how I work about with the data on the back end. Example findings, which is probably the most common thing people are thinking about including. As you can see here, I only have 2, and that is very intentional. Oftentimes I find people feel the need to have anywhere from like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 insights. You don't need to share everything. It's okay. You don't necessarily need to share everything. Pick the top 2 to 3 that you're really trying to emphasize. I say 2 to 3 lightly. If you need to do 4 to 5, totally fine. But really at the end of the day, if I'm an interviewer watching you present your research, I'm not going to remember all findings. Trust me, I won't remember them. So what are the top 1 to 3 things that you really want me to take away from this research that are going to be the most impactful? Here, as you can see too, I have a supporting visual highlighting the case or highlighting the points that are being made within the findings. And I also have some supporting quotes as well. If the page is not overly cluttered, I'm trying not to put too much on there, but at least you get a sense of like, here's some supporting evidence. And also, if you can't visualize what I'm talking about, here's actually a photo of it too. What is your reporting style? In research, that's actually pretty important, is how do you share out your results? Because research, I often say, it's an influencing role at the end of the day. So in this case, I demonstrate like, hey, I'm flexible enough where if the PM needs it like yesterday, I could just whip up a quick document, have links that go to verbatim comments if they want additional findings. But basically I'm showcasing here, and again, it's all blurred out. I'm not necessarily showing any of the proprietary information from Acorns, but I'm just highlighting like, what are the ways in which I engage with stakeholders? Because 9 out of 10 times when you look at job descriptions, they're always asking like, can have clear communication with stakeholders. This is kind of some of those ways that you can actually incorporate that into your case studies for UX research. And then the other thing too is noting any type of updates or impact that you have. I'm showcasing here some of the design updates that were actually changed based off of the actual feedback that we have. Again, I'm keeping it super simple, just highlighting certain areas in here. And then I lead into the next steps, which is transitioning into the second study, which was more so focused on interviews. I won't go through the same structure again because it's very similar, but you can see here I'm trying to get a pattern so that way people don't necessarily have to context switch too much. They can be like, oh yeah, okay, new research objective, new methodology and why we're using this methodology, new interview logistics, all that stuff. But I'm keeping it simple so that way people can easily follow along. The things that do vary a little bit differently is because it's interviews, I actually want to showcase a bit more of what are the types of questions I might ask. So here I have an actual example from the discussion guide. So that way people can see, like if I send this case study out afterwards and they really want to know what types of questions am I asking, they can take the time to just do a quick scan of it, which is nice. Other things I'm showcasing here is I'm flexible with regards to the share out, as I mentioned before. So I already know the previous report, I showed how I did a Google document. This case, I'm showing out a deck creation. And I'm not just saying like, oh, I created a deck, but I'm talking about why did I create a deck as opposed to doing Google document. Knowing what style of presenting is going to have the most impact is really important in research. So it's nice to kind of show that variation here. Along with another thing that's very common in research is hosting a workshop, right? Like this is very classic. Everyone talks about like, oh, let's get together. Let's talk about the findings. Let's brainstorm, stuff like that. It's so interesting because it's such a big thing in research, but yet I rarely see it come up in case studies. I do not see people talking about that collaborative effort of getting people together to really dive deep into these findings. And it's a really great skill set to have. So if you are using it, highly recommend, consider adding it in your case study, even again, even if it's just one line or two and just an image of it, it does go a long way with helping you stand out a bit more, because again, it's showing those facilitation leadership skills and being able to really engage with your stakeholders, which again, as I said, it's a 90% of this job is how do you engage with stakeholders. And then same thing as before, I only have 3 findings here. I'm highlighting it in the same way, also showcasing like what were the changes that were made. It's a very similar structure to before, so that way it's not too overwhelming. And then afterwards, I talk about tying it all together to what were the results of this. So in this case, I'm showcasing pretty much like high level, what's the impact of this report. So in this case, I'm just mentioning like, significant increase in deposits and adoption. However, I'm not specifying the exact metrics here. That is a common question that people ask. They're like, I need to put in the metrics. No, you don't. Trust me, you don't have to. People will be understanding, especially in research, that you can't specify the exact numbers here. But pretty much, I'm not specifying any of the exact logistics or business metrics involved, but I'm mentioning kind of like what is that overall general impact. And then I'm mentioning also on a quick line, what are the next steps that I would recommend if we're continuing on with this project here. And then last, certainly not least, reflection. So this is why I have this set at the very end of both case studies, is because I want to talk about how I can basically reflect both in the short term, right? So like after doing a first study and after doing a second study, what are the things that I'm remembering that I'm like, okay, I would do this differently, but then also being able to take even a further step back and look at logistics, like the overall overview of a mixed methods project. What are the things that I would be considering? So that's really it. And that's it. That's where I end off at thank you. And then I tip my hat and I'm saying, okay, please hire me. But pretty much this is the example that I would have for a case study. So now you know the context in which how we would go about this. But the thing that I want to focus on as well is, okay, how do we even get there, right? Like, it's nice to have the final output, but I know a lot of people that I have mentored say like, girl, I don't know how you got there. So this is really now the meat and the potatoes, is focusing on how do you actually get there. And the first thing I want to talk about is how do you actually plan out a case study? And there's no one correct way. I'm actually going to show you 5 different ways to plan out a case study, but this is really important to know, even if you feel like, oh, this is whatever. It's really important to know what style of planning works best for you, because case studies can be very time consuming. They could take a lot of energy out of you. Trust me, it took me a lot of energy to create. So you want to set yourself up for success at the very beginning to make sure it's like, hey, I know how my brain works and I know what's going to be the easiest way for me to get this done. So that way, by the time you get to the end of your case study, you feel like you actually have energy and you're not just like, oh, how did I do that? So let's start with a couple of different ways. First example, I'm going to call is kind of like the linear outliner. So you might be the type of person that likes to get all their thoughts in one place and organize them from A to Z. So you can think of this overall as people kind of that are just want to get in a Word document, start in chronological order, go from section to section, start filling out the details. And this is great. If you prefer that clarity, that structure before like getting into the actual designs of the case study, that's totally cool. It's a way you can do it, but it is not the required way. There are other ways to do it as well. So if it works for you, fantastic. If it doesn't, though, I have a couple of different ways you can see too. So second thing, which I would guesstimate that a lot of people here who are UX designers might actually work in more so, is a visual organizer. So these are the girlies, the guys that really appreciate like a Fig Jam, a Miro, any type of whiteboarding space is really the happy place here. So you're really thinking about stuff in groups and buckets. And you might be the type of person that's focused more so on like, okay, let me start with a collection of thoughts here, a collection of thoughts there. Let me delete some things, let me add some things, but you're really just organizing all of the information out spatially first in order to create that sort of story and see the shape of it. And again, that's totally a great way to do a case study as well. If that's your jam, please consider it. There's more than one way to do it. Very similar to this though, if it's not visual organizer, it might also be what I'm going to call a modular builder. So this type of person in particular, they don't necessarily start from the beginning, but they start where their energy is. But you might be the type of person that's like, man, you know what? Today's feeling like the day I want to write that impact section. It just happens where you're like, I don't want to write the background. I'm intimidated. I don't want to do it, but I really want to do the findings section and just jump right in. That's okay. You can do that. You can work on things in chunks. You can start directly in your slides and start creating those sections, but in different areas. It's great if you're feeling overwhelmed with starting from beginning to end and you kind of work more in those energy style bursts. Next is the collector. So this one in particular is someone that feels like, unlike the linear outliner who's writing everything out, but may not necessarily know where all the resources are that they need to pull together. This is the person that starts resources first. It's like, let me grab everything that I have, whether it's screenshots, whether it's notes, stakeholder quotes, Slack messages, raw data, literally everything that I know I want to build into my case study and put it all in one folder. This is great if you really feel like you're worried about whether or not you're going to find that one piece of evidence. You can start with all the evidence first. Just grab everything, just put it in one section, and it really helps with making sure that you have all the details first, and then you can start going into more of that documentation of how you want to create that case study. So again, another option. And then the last one, which is the one I tend to do and actually use for this presentation, is the story first thinker. So this is kind of like what you're trying to really focus on. What is the message I'm trying to tell? What's the journey I want to take people on? So for this presentation, I actually wrote the elevator pitch. So kind of that summary of what this is supposed to be about first. And then I was like, okay, let me actually create the documents, create the slides for it. So this is something where if you're really someone that really just wants to emphasize the storytelling aspects and making sure that's a memorable experience, this might be your jam. Feel free to take a screenshot of this if you would like to, but this is just really like the high level recap of the 5 different ways that people might go about with planning out a case study. This is not just for research, it's really just for any type of case study that you're going to be doing and presenting. But it just really, really helps, because if you're working in a way that does not work with what you know is going to motivate you, you are creating extra friction that does not need to be there in the first place. And trust me, there's going to be a lot that you need to do for this project. So why not work in the way that works best for you? So just be very intentional about how you are setting yourself up for success here. Okay. Key elements. This is, again, I always say meat and potatoes, but this is also the really crucial part, is what do you actually include in the case study? So some of these things are going to be similar to what I've mentioned when I was walking through my case study. Yeah, sometimes you need to hear things a couple of times just because it really needs to emphasize those points, but there will be new tips in there as well as I break down these sections, but really just want to highlight some key points here. So first thing that you want to start with, problem statement, background, however you want to call it, but you're really focusing on framing what is the user or business problem you're trying to solve here. As I've mentioned throughout the previous study, keep it crisp, avoid buzzwords, no buzzwords here. Couple things to keep in mind. If you are a student, you might be like, someone just told me like, hey, I need to do this research project, and they gave me the methods, and we didn't necessarily have a problem statement. We were just doing a lesson on how to do these types of methods. And for that, I would say sometimes you can actually reverse engineer the problem statement. So the example I like to give is, in my grad school program, we did a study on Goodreads and trying to improve the app. And we were already told the methods we were going to use for it. However, to make it actually feel more like a case study for corporate, what I did was I looked at what are the app Play Store review comments right now, pulled out some that were talking about how, oh, this app is really it's really not user friendly. I can't find these resources. I can't figure out where to go to find my book, all that stuff, right? And I pulled them out and put them in my case study to showcase hey, this is why we want to do research in the first place. The professor didn't tell me to do that. No one told me to do that, but I did that with intention. So that way, when I present it to actual companies, I could showcase hey, it's not just, we're just told what to do, but there's actually a reason behind why we're doing the research in the first place. So something to keep in mind is sometimes you can reverse engineer that problem statement. And then the other thing to note too is, let's say you're on the reverse end. So let's say you're in corporate and you're in B2B, or any complex product, I would say. It's important to also include side definitions for words that may not be common knowledge. And when I say that, I mean, I've had conversations with mentees where they're like, oh, we did this whole case study on intranet. And if I didn't know what intranet was, different from internet, I would be like, okay, I'm lost from the beginning and I'm kind of zoning out. So if it's a word that you feel like the average person that you're trying to apply for, like in any different type of, I guess I'll say, if you're applying for a field that is not necessarily the original field that you are originally that you're in right now, I would recommend trying to make sure that you include just some definitions to make sure you're bringing everyone up to speed on what you're talking about there. So that's the first one. Second thing, stakeholder involvement. This is the most common question when I'm sitting in on interviews that people often don't expect, but do get asked, and just be mindful of it. People want to know pretty much who is involved, what's your role. So who are really your partners in crime here? Are you working with designers? Are you working with product? Are you like designer, product manager, researcher? How many of them are there? Things like that. I would say you don't have to go super deep into this. As you saw in my previous case study, it was a solo project. So it was really just me and the PM. And I just enacted that conversation. So you don't have to go super in depth, but just know that people will probably ask that question. So 1 to 2 sentences about, what your role was is helpful and beneficial for the setup here. Okay, 3, research objective. This is, again, spelling out what is the specific question or goal you're trying to answer with this research. Researchers normally don't struggle with this as much, but I often find that designers and product managers, like when I'm looking at a case study that involves research at some point, they'll just say like, oh, we wanted to get feedback on the designs. And I'm like, okay, but like what type of feedback? There's so many types. Is it sentiment? Is it usability? Like, what are we looking for here? So just, again, just one extra line of clarity of like what type of feedback are you looking for can really go a long way here. If you could tie it back to business metrics here, that could be helpful. So really just trying to emphasize like, why should we care? Why does this research matter at the end of the day? Methodology. Again, this is the thing I highlighted a lot in the case study, just highlighting it here. It's important to explain why you chose the method. If you don't take away anything else from this conversation, please, please, please talk about why you did this method, because that's really the opportunity to showcase your research knowledge and shine here. And it's also the great point to be able to incorporate any constraints, logistical things that you had to keep in mind. It can all just kind of be built into this methodology section here. Okay, 5, recruitment. So you also want to talk about who's your target audience for this recruitment. Not surprising, but pretty much, again, it's the why, like what characteristics are important for, for these people to have. And also to, let's say, for example, I've seen some people mention that, hey, I wanted to do like research, but I could only get like friends and family, right? It's a personal project. It's not something that they have budget and time to recruit other people for. That's okay. That's totally fine and understandable. What I would recommend doing in those cases is talk about pretty much, okay, if you couldn't get the ideal target audience, what would have at least been the ideal target audience? So that way I know that you're not just like, oh, like I think if I'm doing research, I should only just be able to grab like whoever I can, and that's all that matters, because that doesn't signal to me whether or not you understand like the importance of recruitment versus you telling me like, oh, if I could recruit whoever, this would have been like the target recruitment. But in this case, due to budgeting, logistics, things like that, things that are out of your hand, basically, this is what you had to work with in terms of the limitations. And that totally works too. It's just really showcasing what is your thought process at the end of the day. That's what I'm focusing on and trying to see how much research knowledge do you have really. Okay, 6. After this, only 3 more, I promise. But this is the finding. So this is focusing on breaking down essentially what you've learned into digestible themes, quotes, or charts, and also connecting the dots to these key recommendations. If possible, if you're starting off with a case study for the first time in research, it's normally easier to pair the insight with the recommendation. That's something that I think a lot of people hear, but sometimes forget about, is that you don't want to necessarily do here's a bunch of research insights, and then here's a bunch of recommendations on another page, and then you're trying to connect the dots of like what goes to where. As you see, this is a rule that could be broken because I didn't do that in my case study. However, I did try to at least line up the finding in the first one to the recommendation bullet on the next page. So it's in order, so to speak. So just something to keep in mind. It does help a lot with the storytelling aspect of it. And again, leaning on visuals or screenshots to explain what your findings are referring to. It does not have to be flashy, guys. It really doesn't. But if you are working with any product that I would say is visual in some nature, whether it's a physical product or digital product, please take some, even if you showed it earlier on in the presentation, please show it again here, because we will forget when we're interviewing, we will forget what it looks like. So it's really helpful to have the findings and then for us to be able to actually refer back to, oh, okay, this is what they're referring to on a visual scale, because it's much harder to try to visualize those things when you're getting introduced to a concept for the first time. Okay, 7, impact. The buzzword that everyone talks about, talking about pretty much what's changed because of your work. Bonus points, obviously, if you can quantify it, which is obviously what people talk about, which is the business metrics. And this is where I see most people get stumped, especially people earlier on in their career, because they're like, okay, I can't specify the metrics. Or you might be in my case where it's like, I'm not allowed to speak about these actual business metrics. The good thing is there's other ways to kind of tackle these things. So for example, let's say you don't have any business metrics because you're working on a project that is more so like either student project or personal project. You can always do a pre-test and a post-test. Like it could be as simple as CSAT, which is a satisfaction score in the beginning, do the update, and then do the change, and then do the test afterwards again. And that would be something that would easily be like, hey, I could describe my impact. But it doesn't always have to be a metric. Sometimes if you don't have metrics, it could be, hey, what decisions were made based off of this research. It could also just be collaboration efforts. This is something that people don't emphasize a lot, but when you're in an organization, especially if you're in a startup type of environment, getting people into an environment that's a bit more like research maturity level is good. If you're trying to say, hey, we got more people educated on research, we got people more exposed to what are interviews, had people sit in on them, things like that, that is a win. That is an impact right there. You are showcasing the value of research. Other things to mention too is it could also be new processes created. Did you find a way to streamline research to make it go even faster for like recruitment, for example? Talk about it. I want to hear all about the good, cool stuff that just came up along the way when you were creating this project. And last but certainly not least, if you have any stakeholder feedback as well that, you can't pair any metrics or things like that, but a stakeholder could at least vouch for your research, please feel free to include that as well. That's also something that can come handy. So that's something I just wanted to mention with regards to impact. And then the personal learnings and next steps. Actually, I think it's only 8 slides, so should be the last one here. But this one's really focused on what would you do differently next time? And also what further research or next steps would you do, or would you recommend at least to stakeholders? This section does not have to be long, guys. I've seen people do like paragraphs and paragraphs, and totally feel free. Like, again, don't feel like you have to take what resonates from what I'm talking about and leave the rest. But I often feel like, just a sentence or two here works. And it's really, we're just trying to showcase a bit more of that humility, but also really focused on seeing how you are learning and constantly growing in whatever your craft is. So in summary, again, feel free to screenshot this page, but I would say the most important things to be considering: problem statement, stakeholder involvement, the research objective, methodology, recruitment, findings, impact, and personal learnings. If you're actually a person who does research but isn't necessarily a researcher full time, that's totally okay too. You might just focus a bit more on, very light level talking about or it might be very in-depth on problem statement if you're a product manager, but then going a bit lighter in terms of what's the recruitment like. But really the ones I'd say you want to emphasize the most are why this methodology and the findings are really the big things, along with impact. So that's the meat and potatoes if you really need to cut it down short. Okay. Now, almost towards the end, this is the final section, which is what are the top 5 common pitfalls that I see. So outside of all the stuff I just mentioned, what are the things that I tend to see people doing a lot of in their UX research case studies that you don't necessarily have to do. Too much focus on operations. So oftentimes people take a lot of time to focus on like, oh, we couldn't find the people that we wanted, so we went to like this Slack channel and tried to recruit from here, but then we had this complication, so we went to another Slack channel. Like, I don't necessarily need to know that type of stuff. And it's not to say it's bad. I mean, there are research operation roles, and if that's what you're applying to, please, by all means, go into that. But when you're applying for something that's a researcher role, or even a step further back, a person who does research but is not doing it full time, I don't need to know necessarily about the operations. I'm more focused on the theory and how you are applying research methods, but I don't need to go in, we don't necessarily need to go into the weeds of like how you got the actual things done, so to speak. So something to keep in mind there. The second thing is that oftentimes I see people kind of framing themselves as a side character in their own story. And when I say that, I'm just saying, regardless of what type of case study you're doing, take a step back and think about the word choice. Words do matter, but really think about like, okay, am I explaining things in a reactive or a proactive way? So when you're talking about your, let's say the problem statement, are you saying it in a way where it's like, hey, someone asked me to do this, and from that, I decided like, okay, I'm going to help them with this and blah, blah, blah. Or are you framing it as like, hey, I took the initiative and assisted this team with doing X, Y, Z, and I led blah, blah, blah. It's the same context. It could be the exact same story. But if you're framing yourself more as the hero, the person that's taking initiative, taking action, rather than the person that, things are happening to them, those are big indicators for how people are going to kind of perceive whether or not you can be up on your feet, or if you're someone that's like, we have to tell them exactly what to do here. Something to keep in mind is, how are you framing yourself throughout the story? Are you framing yourself as the hero or as a side character where things are happening to you? Not surprising. I mentioned it before. I'll just skim it really high level. Don't feel like you have to put all of your insights in here. It's really not needed. Again, just 1 to 3 is totally good. And also jargon. Please be aware of that. It happens more often than you think. Really have someone read it that is not familiar with your field at all, and have them go through it and see what things they ask as questions. If they are asking questions, that is an indicator that you should adjust or at least add definitions to what you're talking about. And if they read it and they're like, oh, this made total sense, then bravo, you got the case study pretty much down there. So that's good. The fourth thing is no closing of the loop in the story. Sometimes something that happens is you'll start off with a case study, and at the very beginning, we're talking about this problem statement, and we're like, oh, okay, we want to understand, is this content resonating with people? Do people understand it? Is it clear? And then we do the whole research study. And then at the very end, we start to realize, oh, the findings are talking about like, oh, this color choice didn't resonate with people, or like, oh, they don't like this visual. And that's fine. Research can totally evolve over time. Like, sometimes what you start out with is not necessarily what you end with, but it's an indicator to some people that they might think like, oh, they might not be able to follow the instructions because what they said was the problem in the beginning was not what they ended up with at the end, in terms of like what were the results that are supposed to be tied to it. So just make sure you're mindful of like what you're starting with and what you're ending with tie back together. What your findings and what your recommendations are, tie together, because it happens more often, surprisingly than not, that people might miss something, and then all of a sudden, if you look back, it's like, oh, this story is not lining up to what I'm trying to tell at the very beginning. So please be aware of that. And then the last thing that I would say, if possible, is it can be really difficult with context switching between studies. So when I got the request for my 2 case studies, I knew I didn't want to overwhelm people with context switching. So when I say that, I mean, there's a lot of times people are like, oh, I'm going to show all the different types of things I can do, right? So I'm going to showcase like a study about cars, and then I'm going to showcase a study about clothes, and then I'm going to showcase a study about cybersecurity. That is a lot for an interviewer to jump between from study to study. By the time I'm understanding what you're talking about with cars, all of a sudden we're talking about clothes, and that's a lot. So by the time you get to the end of the interview cycle, people are going to be like, I don't know what questions to ask because I feel overwhelmed by how many things I'm switching between. So if possible, if you can kind of have either a thread that ties the stories together. Again, with UX research, it's kind of nice if you have a mixed methods report, you can break it out into 2 different studies, or if you can at least get them within a similar range, that's normally super helpful for someone to follow through with the story. But again, everything has exceptions too. Let's say for some reason or let's say you're working for a consulting firm and they want to see a wide variety of things, then please, by all means, feel free to do a wide variety. But I oftentimes just feel that when I'm sitting in watching interviews, it can be overwhelming to watch so many different types of projects go by. So if you can have some type of common thread, or at least some things that fall in a similar category, that can be super helpful. And with that said, that is the presentation. So thank you so much for letting me present. And if there are any questions, this is now the time for them.
There are a few questions.
Amazing.
I have a question that I want to ask first, and then we'll go into questions.
Perfect.
So a problem I see with a lot of junior designers and senior designers for that matter is working on your portfolio is like a daunting task. And so they have a really hard time like being done because it's such a big task. Do you have any tips for being iterative on your portfolio and not making it like this whole big thing?
I will say, as I'm very much a perfectionist, so I do follow this case sometimes where it's like, it's hard to say it's done when it's done. Oftentimes, the way I like to look at my work is I try to think, what's at least the MVP? And if anyone doesn't know, that's the minimum viable product, which in fancy business language is just meaning like, what is the thing at the end of the day where if you had to present, this is the minimum thing where you're like, okay, at least this is presentable. Get to that first. I often find that people really try to perfect every single page in section first, and then they try to be like, okay, by the time you get halfway through, you're so exhausted. It's like the ending kind of fizzles out. So I recommend, if you tend to find yourself kind of constantly iterating through things and not knowing when's the end in mind, just at least focus on getting what is your baseline, what is the minimum case study where you're like, okay, if nothing else happens, at least I'm okay with presenting this. That kind of just helps with beating a bit more of that perfectionistic quality that some of us can have.
And the next question is another question that I also had because it comes up a lot. How would you tackle what you cover in your portfolio versus what you cover in a presentation that you give during the presentation portion of an interview? How do you differentiate the level of detail that you go into or the type of story you would tell?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oftentimes I find that it's not too different. There are subtle tweaks. Actually, the presentation that I showed you now, I have made it in a standalone reading format. The way I go about doing that is usually presentations have a bit more visuals, while the actual portfolio, anything that's like reading alone, so you're not there to voice over, it's going to have a little bit extra in terms of context. So the way I almost kind of style it, I suppose, is like, sometimes I like to go about trying to figure out what would be the way I would present this in a verbal format. And then once I'm done creating not a deck, but a case study around that, then I'm just adding in my speaker notes. I'm like, what are the things where if I'm not there, what would I add in here so that way it still reads fine on its own? I find that to be a little bit easier than doing the reverse. I often find that when people try to create the case study first, it can get very overwhelming with feeling like I have to write all of these things out versus being like, let's just start with what would you visually showcase? And then let's actually add in the little details there. So that's another way that you can go about.
And next we have a question from Michelle, which is, do you have any tips for distilling long or complicated or messy projects into a good case study?
Ooh, that's a fun one. Long, complicated, messy case studies. So really think back to like what type of planning style that you're going to have, because that's really going to help you figure out like, how do you want to break this down? So for me, for example, I do a lot of story first thinking. So what I'm going to be thinking about is I kind of like take a step back and remove myself from the whole messy chaoticness. And I'm like, what are the skills I want to highlight here? what are the points that I feel like are the most impactful in terms of what I'm telling. I grab those first and I limit myself to. I know at the end of the day, I wish I could talk about myself forever. Like I wish I could, spend 2 hours talking to the interviewers about all the amazing things I've done and why you should hire me. But I know there's a limited amount of time, right? So instead of doing that, I just kind of limit myself to say, okay, based off of this time, I know these are the beats in the story that I need to hit because these are the ones that are the most impactful based off of the job description here. And then that's when you start to work backwards and say, okay, from that, like, what are the things that I can basically cut out here that are not necessarily tied to those beats? So I would say you're kind of forming the skeleton first of the story. And then after that, you kind of go about being like, okay, the rest is like the stuff that I can just cut through. So hopefully that kind of helps. Again, that's my style of working. I'm not saying it's something that works for everyone, but if you're really like, I don't know where to start, that's kind of like a suggestion point of where you might be able to.
And then Sonia has her hand raised. Sonia, do you want to ask your question verbally?
Hi. I have a question because I have a case study that I've been working on and I have direct impact, like the things that I did while I was working for the group. And then I also have some insights from a huge study with 6,500 plus reviews where now, if you get an ADP list, you can actually see the buttons that came from those insights. So I'm wondering, how do we talk about the impact that we made while we were actually working on a product, but also the future state impacts that people might see today as a result?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel like normally when I do that in case studies, I'm thinking about stuff a bit more. This again, I usually work in a story format, but I'm usually thinking about stuff also too in chronological order because oftentimes I feel like if I was to talk about future impact first and then talk about like, oh, and then these are the things that were current, then that people would be like, wait, I don't know like what's what. So some things that I would keep in mind. Definitely outlining the difference. Don't have it like on the same page or like whatever is the same section, so to speak, because people will start to get confused there of what's what. Again, second thing, if you can make it chronological in nature, that's definitely something that could help there too. But then the third thing I would think about as well is maybe more so like when you're creating these things, it's kind of like when I'm talking about impact, I would first be focusing on like, okay, and sorry, can you clarify again? You said the first, I know the second one, as you said, is ADP lists. You have like a future button that could have a lot of potential future impact.
Yeah, the study itself, insights, which then informed how do we pick our mentors? Like what were the most helpful types of feedback that we got across a huge set of research?
Okay.
Now people can actually click on the buttons to select those things. Like that immediate impact that helped the team, but like later on, it's like you're planting the seed for something that happens in the future.
Well, I think, Sonia, it sounds like you're already a storytelling. You tell you already have the language in mind, which is great. So I would say definitely focus a bit more on highlighting that beginning portion of like, hey, this was the research, this is what we did. Here's the immediate things in terms of like, measuring like, or not measuring, but like, these were the decisions that were made of it. Here's like what the final output looks like right now currently. And here's like what is the potential like future predictions of like what type of impact that will have over time. Because it's really at the end of the day is like when I'm looking at it from an interviewing perspective, I'm looking to see like what is the through line throughout the entire story that connects these elements together. And in this case, to me, it sounds like more so it's just the chronological placement of it to follow along like that type of impact. So you're kind of to have the impact of the immediate and then you're expanding it out bigger and bigger to showcase like, hey, it's not just something that's small in the immediate, but then it keeps growing over time to like what is like that future end state could be like in terms of impact.
Okay, thank you so much.
Great question.